one of the things that's important for us here at the American Christian Patriot Church is to inform people about things. And in particular, we want to not just rehash the things you keep hearing about and seeing in the newspapers. We want to look at either new issues or go deeper into an issue than other people are going. Last time we had a very interesting talk. This time we have another one, and we're going to go a little bit deeper. But first of all, I want to introduce our panelists tonight. Dave Henderson is over here. He is one of the leaders in the American Christian Patriot Church and also our technical expert. And Keith Broder, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, he is an amazing man who's of faith and also a great expert in the Constitution. So much of his life revolves around learning about and passing on what he has learned about the Constitution, and really some very interesting insights he has presented. I've known him for a number of years now, and he just always has some fascinating stuff to talk about. So since this was going to be a constitutional issue tonight, I invited him to come, and he graciously agreed to be here. So we are grateful for you being here, Keith. Thank you very much. Now, one of the stories that's been in the news now for a couple of weeks or so is what's going on up in Oregon. It's something very similar to what happened at the Bundy Ranch in Nevada a while back, about a couple of years or so back. Now, to bring you up to speed on that, and then we're not just going to rehash what has happened. We have a much deeper issue to consider. So hang on and say, I've read all about that. Now, I don't think you've read about what we're going to talk about. But to bring you up to speed, I've asked Dave, first of all, to just give us the real quick highlights of this situation, how it came about, and then we're going to ask Keith some questions, and then we're going to get into a discussion of this. So Dave, if you would just kind of give us a little background on what's happened here up in Oregon.
Well, initially it started, some ranchers up in the Oregon area named Hammond decided that they needed to do some clearing on their land. Throughout history, ranchers and farmers have done various different methods for clearing their land. But when they become overgrown, one of the common tactics is to do a burn. And they'll burn brush off of their property. In this particular case, the burn got a little way from them. It jumped onto some BLM land, and they managed to get the fire under control and put it out without the aid of the BLM, Bureau of Land Management. And the authorities came in, and instead of basically saying, hey, you messed up, this fire got out of control, they decided to charge them with terrorism. Oh, yeah. So they were convicted of this father and son named Hammond. They served some time in jail and were released. And a judge decided that the punishment did not fit the crime of terrorism and ordered them to be to surrender themselves and go back into the prison system for a number of years. The Bundys have also had their problems with the BLM dealing with land and their ranch in Nevada. And primarily what's happening is the BLM is coming in and saying, telling these ranchers that have been on this land for generations, we no longer allow you to be on this land, you can't have your cattle on this land, and in fact we're going to take this land from you. And the Bundys fought that situation in Nevada and were successful, at least temporarily. The Bundys and some other, what I consider patriots, decided to stage a protest on federal, quote-unquote, federal land at a wildlife refuge. And the situation went on for 3 or 4 weeks. The ranchers on a frequent basis came into the town, attended meetings, met with the FBI for negotiations, and basically their demands were that their grievances be addressed by the federal government, and it had to do with the confiscation of their lands by the federal government. And here, just this past week, the FBI, in their infinite wisdom, decided to at least capture some of the leaders, and instead of letting them come into town and meet with the FBI like they had been doing, they pulled off a traffic stop, and in the process, one of the leaders of the group was shot dead. There's some serious issues that need to be discussed here, and part of it has to do with who owns the land, where that authority comes from, and then also the use of deadly force in this particular predicament, which I'll turn it back over to you on that.
Thank you, David. You did an excellent job of summarizing that. Now, if you see any of this in the news, and it's been kind of scarce. I mean, you think about some people have been shot over the last couple of years, and the news coverage that you get. Now, this guy gets shot, and it's hard to find.
Okay. If he was black, gay, or a polar bear, you'd hear about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But we don't want to talk about so much about that issue. I mean, that's what you do hear about is about that, you know, what about the ranchers, the burn, the punishment, the reaction, the occupation of this federal building, and then the subsequent shooting. But we want to deal with a deeper issue, and that's why we've got Keith here. And so I'm going to ask him a few questions, just going to give a very brief answer. We want to keep this very short and concise so that you can understand the gravity of the situation here and what is the real issue that underlies all of this. Okay, so first of all, Keith, according to the Constitution, what lands are the federal government allowed to manage?
Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 it tells the jurisdiction of the government of the United States. It says that the government of the United States authority shall not exceed 10 miles square. The seat of our government, Washington, D.C., is the only area where the government has constitutional authority to exist. It goes on to say that the only lands that the government can possess are territories. And the territories cease to exist when a state is created. All of the land in a territory is to be ceded to the state once the state has been established. So, for example, California has 100 million acres. All of that land, when California became a state, all that 100 million acres was to be ceded to the state of California. Today, the federal government controls 44% of California, 44 million acres in California. The Constitution says that for the federal government to actually own and possess land, they can do it under certain special conditions. The land must be used for military fortifications, dockyards, needful buildings, arsenals, etc. National parks is not in that category, or neither is rangeland. All of that is not authorized to be owned. It also says that in order for the government to take control of this land, they can build a dockyard or whatever, but they need to get permission from the state, and they need to pay for it. None of these things have ever taken place. So the jurisdiction of the United States is, in fact, to be a citizen of the United States, that means you're a citizen of Washington, D.C. The government has no constitutional authority of anybody living outside of the District of Columbia. I was at the Bundy Ranch, by the way, so I met Ammon Bundy, and I was in the home of Cliven Bundy, and I was there, and I never in my life felt such a spirit. I mean, I was standing there when the cows were released. And as I watched those cows being released, and I knew that the Bureau of Land Management had guns pointed at us, and I saw that, and I knew that some crackpot could fire a shot, and I might be meeting my maker very, very soon. But you know, we've got to understand that, you know, if you're governed by fear, you're not able to do what is right. You've got to have the courage. If your life is, you know, if you're not willing to die for something, then you've really got nothing to live for either.
So just real quick summary then. The Constitution of the United States authorizes the federal government to own not more than 10 square miles, which became Washington, D.C., forts and ports, and that's pretty much it. Now, that being the case, Keith, did any of the land in question in Oregon, or for that matter on the Bundy Ranch, or there was the Bundy issue, did any of that land fit into this criteria?
Absolutely not.
Well, then, since the federal government has no legal right to these lands, is it entitled to manage them?
The Bureau of Land Management is a corporation, just like Burger King and just like Walmart and just like Goldman Sachs. If Burger King took over that land in Oregon, would the American people stand for it? Of course not. Well, Burger King has just as much authority as the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management is a corporation. It was actually a corporation that was domiciled, I believe, in Puerto Rico. It's a foreign-owned corporation with foreign investors. Wow. The property managers of if you have an apartment complex and you have a property manager, they don't own the land, they manage it. But they manage it for the landlord. Well, who is the landlord? Is the landlord this government, or is it the people of the state of Oregon? Who is the landlord?
So we've seen then that the federal government has no legal right to these lands. It has no right to manage these lands. That being the case, is it entitled to write and enforce laws pertaining to these lands?
And absolutely not. And frankly, it goes right back to the First Amendment. How many parts are there? This is a little quiz question. How many parts are there to the First Amendment? How many bullet points are there? Does anybody know? 5. Okay. The last one is one of the ones there is to petition the government for redress of grievances. In other words, when the government steps outside of their area of authority, it's not only our right, but it's our duty to stand up and speak up. And Ammon Bundy and these other men are exercising their First Amendment right to, number one, for their freedom of speech, and for them to petition the government for redress of grievances. And so, it's obviously, you know, when you complain against a tyrant, things go bad. There was a Mormon fella in Germany named Helmut Hubner who started to complain about Hitler. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he was a 17-year-old, and he started complaining about Hitler. Well, he was taken before what they called the blood tribunal, and he was guillotined to death. And of course, the Mormon Church, because they didn't want to upset the Fuhrer, they excommunicated him posthumously. So again, tyrants don't play by the rules. The rules were written to protect us. But because the government has taken the Constitution and shredded it with something called the doctrine of implied powers, there are no implied powers. The Constitution is what it is, it says what it says, and there is no implied powers. If it's not delegated and it's not enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, they can't do it. It's prohibited. We need to understand the Constitution. I have a website, constitutionclub.com, usconstitutionclub.com. I got about 4,000 people all around the country who go there from time to time to learn more about their rights and responsibilities.
So let's take this down here again. The federal government has no right to this land. They have no right to manage the land. They have no right to write regulations for this land. So can we assume then that it also has no right to rightfully, legally arrest, charge, try, judge, fine, and incarcerate these ranchers and farmers?
According to the law, the chief law enforcement officer of the county, Mr. Maxwell, who is the chief law enforcement officer in the county?
Sheriff.
The sheriff, absolutely. If the Bundys or anyone else is to be arrested, the authority is his. And frankly, what the sheriff of that county should have done, and he also was appointed, but what he should have done is he said, look, we'll handle it here. If I need your help, I'll call you. If I don't call you, then stay the hell out of my state. Because the problem is that a lot of these sheriffs have essentially become like you said, the Sanhedrin. They become the puppets for the federal government.
So the federal government has no right to this land. In fact, the Constitution basically prohibits it from having these lands outside of these narrowly enumerated parcels. It has therefore no right to manage it, no right to legislate for it, no right to arrest, to try, to convict, and to punish.
And to shoot and kill.
And to shoot and kill has happened in this case. So let me ask you this question. Who's the real criminal here? The man who died and the men and women who stood with him? Or the one who sent the bullet into him?
I'd just like to say this. His name was Lavoy Finicum. His funeral is in Kanab, Utah on Friday. I'm planning to go. If there's anybody here that would like to go to attend the funeral of that modern-day patriot, let me know.
So this is probably some things that you haven't heard before, but it's true all the same. we have come to assume that the government has the ability, in fact, the power to manage all these lands and do a great many other things. And that simply is not true. And one of the missions of the American Christian Patriot Church is to reveal this to you. Remember, our mission statement is to rebuild the United States of America spiritually, politically, and economically according to biblical principles and the ideals of the founders. The noblest expression of the ideals of the founders, certainly one of the very noblest, is the Constitution of the United States, which, as Keith has said, has been shredded by our government. So, Dave, what are your thoughts on what has happened up there in Oregon? And I know you have an interesting take on this shooting, you know, what it basically amounts to.
Well, you know, I mean, when you look at law enforcement is tasked with the job of enforcing laws. They are also authorized to use deadly force in certain circumstances. Now, I've seen the video, I've watched it, zoomed in close up as much as I can of this particular shooting. And of course the government released a helicopter video that shows very, very little detail. Now, essentially what happened was the federal government decided that they could not have their authority questioned, and they were going to stop it. So they created a scenario where they blocked off 6 miles of this road and performed a traffic stop on this truck full of individuals. The video shows that the vehicle ran from the roadblock for a period of a couple of miles, and then the road was blocked in front of them, so the vehicle went into a snowbank and literally made the vehicle almost impossible to get out of. Lavoy Finicum managed to get out of the vehicle, and he was standing with his arms in the air. And now the question is of course the authorities are saying he reached for a gun, and that was their justification for shooting him. Looking at the video, there's some facts that are very much in doubt. Did he reach for his belt because he had been shot? You can't tell from the video. The only ones that can quote unquote say what happened are the ones that were there, and you know, and of course they're all law enforcement. I'm a very pro law enforcement individual, but I've come over the years to question many of the tactics that are being used. And one of the bare facts here is this man was killed essentially because he was trespassing. Trespassing.
On land that was owned by the people of the state of Oregon.
Yeah. So, first of all, he was exercising his right to protest and demand redress of grievances from the government, as stated in the First Amendment. He was on quote-unquote federal land that by the Constitution does not exist. It is state land. And another point to that is under the 10th Amendment, all of those powers that are not enumerated within the Constitution are reverted back to the people and the states that where the particular event happens. So in this particular case, all of the land by the Constitution belonged to the state of Oregon. Now, they can say that you know, Congress allowed, they voted in these things to happen, but the argument is that Congress cannot enact laws that the Constitution specifically does not allow it to do. The Congress does not have the authority to take over 60 or 70% of the western United States and call it federal land.
Yet they have.
And yet they have.
Do you know that if you go back to the ownership of land, if you go east of Colorado, for example, Texas is 1.8% federally owned. New York is 0.44, less than 1% federally owned. Most of the states east of Colorado are anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7% federally owned. California, 44%, Nevada, 83%, Oregon, 53%, Alaska, 69%. Is that called equal footing? Is that just, if all the states were to be admitted into the Union on equal footing, why is it that we have 1% of Texas, 1.8% of Texas is federally owned, And the mineral rights in California and the lumber rights for 44 million acres are controlled by a fraudulent governmental corporation.
Well, from this discussion, I think we've raised an issue and argued it very clearly, that the federal government is not entitled to manage this land. They're not entitled to write rules regarding its administration. They're not entitled to arrest people for going onto these lands. These lands, by the Constitution itself, should belong to the states. But there's another issue that occurred to me here a few days ago, on the very day that Mr. Finicum was shot and killed, early enough in the day to be covered by the news. I was watching some of the news stories. And you know what they were talking about? Trump, who was not going to join in the debate, all the other candidates in the debate. The debate was the big thing coming in, and about Bernie and Hillary on the other side, and all this stuff was going on. And I was thinking, when are they going to start talking about the shooting? A man is dead. And you know that from past experience, if that man had been a different shade, or as Keith said, if he had been black, a homosexual, or a polar bear, they'd be covering nothing else. Why didn't they cover this? Now, that's an interesting question. Now, here's a thought on that. Now, I know that some people think it's spooky and kooky to get into some of these conspiratorial theories, but if you know what's going on in this country, it would be spooky and kooky not to think that there's some people behind the scenes that are pulling the strings on the Republican and Democratic parties. We are watching a political theater here, and it's designed to make us concentrate on Punch and Judy duking it out with one another, and to ignore the people who are pulling the strings. Well, somebody's pulling the strings back there, and it's not the Republican Central Committee or the Democratic Central Committee. But think about this. Let's put this news story in its context. Why wouldn't these power elite want this story to be covered? Look at the other stories that they've covered. You know, they want you to concentrate on this political theater. Everybody's concentrating on the presidential election, right? You know what?
Yeah, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, they get all kinds of coverage. But not
and that's part of it. Right now, they're talking about the political election because they want you to think you still have some power. They want you to think that your choice still matters. That if you make the right choice on the Republican side or the Democratic side, it's going to save this nation, and it's not. We exist in a corrupt system, and no matter who you put in the Oval Office, they only have about this much wiggle room, and they will not save this nation. Only thing they can do is speed up or slow down the rate at which we're heading toward the cliff. Now, they want you, the power elite wants you to concentrate on that because that makes you feel like you're in power, and you stop thinking about those who really are in power and are shifting all the wealth from your pocket into theirs. But as Keith mentioned, think about the stories that did get a lot of coverage. Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. Well, why would they cover that and not this one? They're similar. Somebody got shot, tragically. Well, because with Trayvon Martin and with Michael Brown and some others, it creates a groundswell for the government to do more, which is exactly what the string pullers want to have happen. Because as the government gets stronger, they get stronger. But not this shooting. Why is this shooting different? Because this was actually a rebellion against the federal government. And they want to keep that as quiet as possible because they don't want you to think that you can actually make a difference. And if they show these people who are actually standing up to the federal government and telling them what they think of them and saying, you know, you are wrong and publicizing that, no, they don't want that word getting out there. So that's just another thing now. So what do you think, guys? Am I crazy on this, or is there something to do?
One last thing I just want to say, and that is Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Henry David Thoreau, all made and Thomas Jefferson, all made quotations basically that communicated this one idea, and that is when a law is unjust, it is not only your right, but it is your duty to disobey and not to comply. Can you imagine what would happen on April 15th if 10% of the American people told people to take the 1040 and shove it where the sun doesn't shine? What are they going to do? The reason that this government is able to exist is because enough of the people are willing to comply with unjust laws and unauthorized illegal authority. Obedience to tyrants is disobedience to God.
Dave, you have, I know, a favorite quote of yours from Edmund Burke.
The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
So good men and women, don't do nothing. Do something. And if your Republicans and your Democrat politicians are not going to do it, then it's time for the church to rise up and get the job done. And that's exactly what the American Christian Patriot Church is all about. So we invite you to join the rebellion. We are standing up against the government. We are standing up for God. And we will rebuild a good and godly America, America the Great. Any questions out here?
I have a comment.
Yes.
One of the things that I see that the government is capitalizing on is what is the same manner that they kept slaves in slavery, and that was, don't let them learn how to read or write, because if they learn to read or write, then they might get ideas. And that's exactly what the government has done, has kept people ignorant of what is going on, because the fact that they can do all these things that you're talking about that are not supposed to be being done, that literally they're breaking the laws, they're the lawbreakers, and yet still are able to put their ideas and their beliefs on us and get away with it for so long, is because the American people have been walking in ignorance of what is going on, and we don't know what's happening, because it's until America wakes up as a people and as a godly nation once again that we will be able to see what is going on and be able to stand up for what is right.
Yes, and that's what we believe this church is going to do.
Amen.
And we have not seen anything like it. It's so needed. It's so needed, and we just support this vision.
Well, you look at our school system. Our school system hasn't taught the Constitution since the 1950s or early 1960s.
Well, you know, the children, when the children come into the world, the government looks at our children as floppy disks.
Yeah.
And when they send them to school to get programmed, our children are being indoctrinated in the schools. They're not being educated, because what our government wants to do, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Nazi Germany, he said it's the role and it's the job of the government to control the formation of public opinion. And so our public schools essentially are our enemy. They are actually helping to program our children not to think, but to conform. They don't teach creativity. They teach conformity. Their basically feeling is a student that is quote unquote good is a student who's obedient, who does what they're told.
And they're punished for questioning any kind of authority whatsoever.
But then the other thing is the mass media, which is controlled by the same financial elite, controls the schools and the government. From every angle, we are being programmed into believing things that are not true. We need to realize that the greatest thing that we can do is to be in touch with our conscience.
That's right.
To question authority.
Yes.
We were born with a brain and the ability to use it, and we should question authority, and we should think, and we should obey just laws, and we should not comply with laws that are unjust.
Which brings us back to what we said about authority. The people in our government right now do not have authority because they're not legitimate, because they're not serving the will of God. And what we've been talking about here too, this is the classic formula for maintaining tyrannies. Keep the people ignorant and intoxicated.
And take away their guns.
Yes, that too, and keep them unarmed. And think about all those things are happening. Our school system is failing. We're making it easier and easier to get all kinds of drugs. Look how marijuana is being legalized in all kinds of places, and regardless of what people will argue, that is a gateway drug, and it has devastating effects. I mean, on your respiratory systems, marijuana smoking is far worse for you than cigarettes, and it's devastating on the brain and brain functions. They're destroying America and America's ability to stand for itself and perpetuate this wonderful system that we had. Again, keep them ignorant, keep them intoxicated,
and
take away their guns.
And I will argue that the only difference between us and the slaves of the mid-1800s is the fact that we don't have chains on.
Amen. That's true.
You need physical chains.
Physical chains.
There was a guy in Germany, a great philosopher named Goethe, and he basically said the most helpless of all slaves is the man who falsely believes he is free.
Yeah. And that's what we said earlier too, about this political theater we're watching. You know, if you think this sounds spooky and kooky, again, think about this. things tend to devolve. Things tend to come unraveled. And our politicians and our bureaucrats, what are some of the main characteristics we have of them? Well, they're incompetent and they're corrupt. Many of them couldn't find their shoelaces with a map and a personal guide. And yet, for over 100 years now, two trends have been working quite consistently. And those are, and they're related, one is the accumulation of more and more power in fewer and fewer places. And the second one is the transfer, or I would say confiscation, of more and more wealth that is created in the private sector and transferring it to the public sector, where the people who control the public sector can control that wealth also. We'll have more to say about this in the future, but think about that. If you think this conspiratorial stuff is spooky and kooky, well, you'd have to be spooky and kooky not to think that this is being directed by someone, because the tendency is for things to fall apart, not to come together. And these are very, very difficult things to pull off. Somebody's got a brilliantly evil plan, and they are executing it with evil brilliance.
How well would we have put up with having a socialist candidate for president?
I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Openly.
I spent half of my life fighting against communism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how many times would somebody else come into office who is on a trip for their own purposes and are being accused by our own government for doing something that is totally wrong and has put so many of us in jeopardy, it's not even funny.
Well, not only that, if you do a Google search for Clinton body count, you will find out that there's been somewhere between 50 and 100 friends of the Clintons who have died mysteriously at young ages. Why isn't there a grand jury investigation to at least find out if there's enough evidence to proceed with an indictment? They're not even willing to look at it. People committing suicide by shooting themselves 4 times in the back of the head.
How often do you do that?
I don't have a clue, but it's certainly, and it's listed as a suicide.
But it all coincides together with the way the government is being run too. You know what I mean? All those things that are happening. You know, the government making all these laws that are, you know, impossible at another time, but now they're just doing it rapidly and just mowing over the American people with no regard for life or anyone.
And I think one of the greatest evidences of that is this. How could somebody like Hillary Clinton get in the position she is? Now, I'm not taking a shot at the Democrats. I take shots at Democrats and Republicans. If I were a Democrat, though, I'd be scratching my head and thinking, come on, is this the best you can come up with? What has she ever done? She's been several things. She's been on government committees, which has some ethical problems. She's been a governor's wife. She's been a president's wife. She's been a senator. She's been a secretary of state. But what has she done? I mean, if you look at the record, this record of the Clintons is a record of corruption and illegality for decades now, and they're getting away with it. How does that happen in a society that's committed to following laws?
You know, one thing, too, that I think is really interesting, does everybody know here who Margaret Sanger is?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, Hillary Clinton has been quoted, and I've got some YouTube videos to share with you if you like, where Hillary Clinton is praising Margaret Sanger, and she's basically saying, Margaret Sanger's quote was that black people are like weeds that need to be exterminated. And Margaret Sanger was the birth mother of the Planned Parenthood, and frankly, Adolf Hitler was quoted as praising Margaret Sanger because a lot of the ideas of Nazi Germany and the Aryan supremacy came from the eugenics movements, which was spawned in the United States.
Her and George Bernard Shaw.
Yeah, Sanger founded a number of things. This eugenics movement, it got discredited by Hitler and the Nazis when people generally kind of were repulsed by this. But she also helped to found what was called the American Birth Control League. Again, all these innocent names, which then evolved into Planned Parenthood. Her stated goal was to get rid of African Americans, both here, well, just all Africans. She found them to be inferior, and she was aggressively working to destroy them. Now, look at the statistics for abortion in the United States over the last 43 years. African Americans constitute roughly around 12-ish% of the population. Look at how many abortions have taken place. It's more than, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's between 2 and 3 times that number of 12%. It's up around, I think, close to 30%. I'm not going to quote me on this. I'm not going to swear that that's correct, but it is huge. In other words, African American babies are being aborted at a rate of at least twice the frequency of others. You think maybe Sanger's activities are starting to succeed here?
The location of Planned Parenthoods, if you'll notice about it, most all of them, they're not located in Beverly Hills. They're located in the inner cities, in the areas where the more black people live.
Like Chicago.
You know, Abraham Lincoln and some of those guys, they wanted to first off try to get the blacks shipped out of the country. When they realized that they couldn't do that, they tried to figure out, well, how can we get rid of them in a way that seems benevolent? Well, why don't we just abort their babies?
I think that's what Pharaoh did, wasn't it?
Yeah.
No matter how you look at it, it's sick.
No.
It's absolutely sick.
Well, we're going to wrap up this episode right now. Thank you for listening in. We hope you'll continue to. Again, check on our website, acpcusa.org. That's ACPC for American Christian Patriot Church, USA, you know what that stands for, .org. And you'll find information about Keith and his website and other things as well on there. We hope you'll be joining us again next time. Again, in our next sermon, we'll be talking about 2 more elements that Christians use to take themselves out of the fight. And we're not going to give you any excuse for not fighting. We're going to talk about turn the other cheek, and those who live by the sword die by the sword. So I want to thank Dave and Keith for being here, and for all the rest of you who have come here tonight. We're going to wrap up with a hymn, and then we're going to dismiss, and then we're going to go here. We're located here in San Bernardino, California. Our hosts graciously are Pastor Miguel and Bernadette Tovar, and we use their facility here at the Cross Church on Highland Avenue, 1170 if you're in the area, East Highland Avenue. And they also have a Christian coffee house adjacent to it. So we're going to wrap this episode up after a hymn.